All right, let's get started. Thank you all for being here. I was a little worried that maybe it would just be Genjo and Joichi and I tonight, so I'm glad folks are here. And this is the third of three lectures, which I titled Racialized Mind. And just as a reminder, and I know I said this the first class and then repeated beginning of the second class. My intent in this is not to be teaching people how to be activists or to try to give a full program of what I think it is to confront the very deep and profound racial karma of the United States. My inspiration or my thought is that there are teachings within Buddhism, particularly these teachings that come from the Yogacara or come from the consciousness-only schools, that can be very useful within the context of doing this kind of work. And so I started out by really encouraging people to get involved in whatever way they can in anti-racism work, whether that's self-education or whether that's activist work, whether that's just making a concerted effort to expand your own experience. There are many, many ways that we can work to undo racism, and while doing those things, these teachings that come from the Yogacara, I feel like, can be a really big ally to doing that kind of work. So that's the spirit in which I have been offering these lectures, and also, with a kind of humility. I have a fairly significant relationship with these teachings. They've been important to me. There are many teachers which take up the Yogacara teachings as their central study for their whole life. And so, when I mentioned to one of my teacher friends, or she saw in something that maybe she was looking at our schedule or something for some reason, she said, "Wow, you're doing a thing on Yogacara and race. I want to see your notes on that." And I was so embarrassed because she's a Dharma heir of Reb Anderson, who's he's the person that everyone sends their students to study Yogacara. So I felt a little like, oh, maybe you don't want to see my notes. But nevertheless, I felt like I have something to offer, and so I'm doing that. So in the way of review, I want to talk about a couple core concepts that developed in the first couple lectures, and then start applying those to the transformation that is offered here within these Buddhist teachings on mind. And there are two drawings. I hurt my hip yesterday, and so that's why I'm moving a little funny. There are two drawings that I keep making, and I want to draw your attention to. The first one has to do with what I've been calling the relational, the way it is that we relate with other beings. So if you think about this as yourself, and you think about this as another person, we'll just talk about people right now because we're talking about race, but it can apply to other types of beings. In this relation, one of the very important things that we do if we take up anti-racism work is we study positionality. And that's a word that I first heard within anti-racism work. I think it gets used in some different places, but it's really important that we learn that our perspective is not everyone's perspective. That seems super obvious, but it's something that's so hard for us to really embrace. And one of the really liberating things about anti-racism work is that it asks us to confront our position, right? And so that's why we use the term positionality. It says that I have a perspective on the world that has to do with who I am within the power relations that have developed through the society that I'm in, and through choices that I've made, and other kinds of currents that are alive in our world. So we study this, right? And it's very challenging. It's especially challenging for people who come from dominating positions within the culture. So if you're white in the United States, your positionality as a white person, it can be very challenging to understand that it is a positionality. For people of color, generally they get it. They're like, well, yeah, I understand I come from a position. You keep reminding me of that all the time. But for white Americans, it tends to be very difficult for us to own that our view is not the view of how things are. It is the view of a person who's embodied and has been part of the process of a creation of something called whiteness, right? Which is itself a power dynamic. Right? So this is the work that we do. So much of the work that we do in trying to understand more deeply, so the anti-racism work can flourish. Within Buddhism, that kind of work is really important, but it hasn't been as emphasized. And within the mind teachings that we're talking about the self and the mind or the heart of ourself. And I've been talking about this as condition. Our conditionality would be, if we wanted to parallel the words with positionality, we could say conditionality. It's, in the psychological term, it's our conditioning. Right? In Buddhism, we would usually call it our formations or our karma. And so we study this, right? And this is where the mind teachings, I believe, can be a real asset. As we're doing this kind of work, how do we understand more deeply, why do I feel aversion in certain situations? Why do I feel fear? Why do I feel a certain kind of greed? Why do I feel like, come on, this is just the way it is, why can't people get over it? All of those kinds of things that occur to me, where are they coming from? And which ones are wholesome and which ones are not wholesome? And how do I transform the unwholesome ones into wholesome ones? And isn't there some way that we could just get over all this conditioning right from the root, right? So this is usually the project of Buddhism. So within the Yogacara teachings, the consciousness only teaching, there is a model that was devised to help us understand something about what's going on here, right? What's happening in this deep part of our mind that makes us see the world in certain ways. So this was the other picture I've been drawing. I've been modifying it a little bit each time I do it. And so this is a kind of a shape. You know, it's just a heuristic. It's just a shape that we can use to try to imagine what's going on here. And it starts out with the world. I would say the world, I might say phenomena. We tend to think of as phenomena as being things that happen out there, right? These kinds of relationships. I'm looking at this other person. What do I see? Okay, how do I see them? So that's based in our sense gates, or our senses. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, right? And those are all centered around, I'm just going to put an M because you might even be able to read the M that I write, but it's getting kind of small. So within the Yogacara system, we talk about the 8 consciousnesses. The first 5 are those sense gates. So eye, ear, nose, tongue, body. Okay. And the reason that I added the world of phenomena here is because this relationship between the senses and the phenomenal world, this is something which Buddhism really has dissected and really has asked us to take a look at for a really long time. And we can see it right here in this relationship that we have with other people. When I see another person, what do I see? Great. It's not just that a person is black or a person is white, a person is Asian. Those are not simple facts that exist outside. Those are phenomena that arise through the connection between senses and mind and phenomena. Because I think of people in a certain way, I start recognizing them in a certain way. This is really, there's a lot of tests that happen if you're doing anti-racism work or any kind of education. You might come across this where they'll show you a bunch of pictures of people and ask you to categorize them by race. It's really interesting. And then you go and do it, and then you see like how do people act? What race do people identify as actually? And there's very interesting things that happen depending on people's facial features. For example, you might see their skin as darker color or a lighter color, simply based on their. And people will swear up and down. They'll swear up and down that this person's skin was darker, this person's was lighter, because in our mind, we have learned to identify and to bundle these things together. So the reason I bring that up is that this is really core to Buddhist understanding, that the mind that is here as a central organizing unit within the whole world of phenomena takes this very primary place. So famous quotes from the Buddha like, the mind is first, everything else follows the mind, like a cart follows a horse. Right? This is coming from that tradition to understand how the mind is so central. The Yogacaras went further, and they analyzed things that were below the threshold of our normal consciousness. So they thought about this as being the world of phenomena, including mind. You can see your thoughts, like you don't always see them, but you can sit and you can contemplate, and you can have an internal experience that's not based on sense objects. But a lot of what's happening is the different kind of sensory inputs are combining with mind, and that's where phenomena are coming from. But the Yogacara people went on to say there's something deeper. And this is in the realm of things that we can't see directly. So there's the alaya, which is the storehouse consciousness. And it's saying that the storehouse consciousness is a place where everything that's happening here in the world of phenomena that we can see, that every movement, every thought that happens here, it leaves a mark here in the alaya. It leaves a mark. That's why it's called the storehouse consciousness, because it has the capacity to hold, to store up all of the karma, all of the movements that happen on this level. And then furthermore, it said that there is a kind of one more mind, which is known as the manas, and the manas is the selfing consciousness. So between the world of phenomena and the storehouse of all of the karma, there is this part of our consciousness which is constantly selfing. And we talked last time a little bit about how these phenomena that emerge up here, because the mind is the central organizer, which is based in manas and alaya, that whatever phenomena appear, they're always appearing in relationship to a set of afflictions. Those afflictions are self-delusion, self-view, self-conceit, and self-attachment. Okay, and if we're doing a longer course on Yogacara, we talk about each one of those and analyze it, etc. But the basic idea is that self-delusion means that I see things from the perspective of grasping onto the self, right? And I have a conceit that myself is right or is important, right? And that that my attachment to the self being protected is really integral. The Yogacara teachings tell us that this happens right at the root of consciousness. This is not something that just kind of like we got taught poorly when we were kids or something like that, but that is the way in which consciousness is emerging through us. So it's very, very easy in this relational situation for us to not consider positionality and to learn to act in relationship with other beings, but rather to center in the self, understand my position as the way things are, and then for others to become the objects of my subject, right? So that rather than living in this kind of relationship that has some kind of giving up of our own insistence on always being at the center, we end up with something that's more like I'm the center and everything is around me, right? And I'm just relating with objects in a world in which I am the subject, I am the actor. So we might ask ourselves, is this just human nature? I mean, this is something that humans do, that seems to have been happening for a really long time. And so I would say possibly. It may be possible that this is human nature. But in Buddhist teachings, we say that we also have Buddha nature. So whether if a human nature is tilted toward delusion, well, that's too bad. And really from a orthodox perspective, human nature is deluded. That's one of the 6 realms that you're born into in samsara. One of them is human, and so at its core, it is deluded. But it's different than this idea of like original sin. Like there's no way that we're just marked irrevocably. And not all doctrines of original sin follow that, but some do. The Buddhist teaching says that we also have Buddha nature, and that we can act through the Buddha nature. We can learn for that Buddha nature to be the center of how we live, as opposed to the samsaric nature. So our job here in working with anti-racism isn't only to be thinking about how is it liberating in a relational way, although that's central to the work, but it's also liberating as an individual being. As we overcome the afflictions, we are also liberated. So this work really is really profoundly liberating. It helps us find all these places where we're holding on to some kind of self-grasping, and to help us release those. So the core teaching then becomes, how are these afflictions, right, which center either in negative karma, which is stored in the storehouse consciousness, or just through the primary afflictions of selfing, how can they be transformed so that we move from this kind of self-centered way of thinking about the world, where we become the subject and the world becomes the object, to a way which recognizes the really deep mutuality between different beings. And that's what we're attempting to do when we talk about transforming through practice. And this is, I think, where the Buddhist teachings really shine. Because there's one way of thinking about all this where we could just say, okay, I need to transform, and so what's the right thing to do? And I'm going to beat myself into shape. I'm just going to bang myself into the shape that is right. And the problem with that is, who gets to decide what's right? Who is going to decide what's right? What is the people with power? And that is a relational thing. The people out in the world, the people with power, are going to decide what's right. And so we're just going to end up replicating the same power structures that we have before. But also, that dominating spirit also moves inward. And the domination that moves inward it can't overcome this central conundrum of wanting to self the world. And so we need a different medicine, at least from the Buddhist perspective. So, as we work on this positionality side, I want to make some recommendations for what I think needs to be happening in that realm, right? And then relate it with this mind teachings work and how those can work together. What's different than just beating yourself into shape about what's happening with employing these kinds of teaching. So, if you're doing this work to face racism, I would say, from my perspective, really the core thing is is to engender care for your relations with others, particularly across racial lines. That doesn't sound very profound, but I think that's really the crux of it. How do you care for those relations? Not just do what you think needs to be done in terms of like getting, keeping everything rolling. But how do you really care for those relations? How is the world not about a bunch of objects that you're going to inflict your subject on, or the subject is just going to receive objects as it believes that it deserves or needs them, right? But what are those relationships? So when that comes to people, particularly if you're doing anti-racism work across racial lines. So are you studying, are you listening to the experiences of people in various positions, various racial positions? So we've got to do that. Connecting with people in your community of all kinds. But particularly, are there people that you typically avoid or that you knowingly or unknowingly navigate around because there's tension around race? Okay. Your own discomfort in many ways will keep you from doing that. To be in unburdened relationships. Now, this is really tricky because what you don't want to do, and again, I don't want to go too on to the relational anti-racism work, but the last thing you want to do is go try to make friends with all the people of color if you're a white person, and sort of expecting them to serve your desire to have relationships so you can become less racist. Okay, that's the kind of beating things into shape that gets us into trouble. A further thing I'd say is to get to know your power position. Okay? To get to know what is your positionality and what kind of power does it hold. And then I guess the last thing, and this list could be really long, but I'm just kind of putting the kind of things I'm thinking that people are doing as they're working anti-racist ways, is to stand up for the recognition of our mutuality, to stand up against racism overtly, to be an ally what can I say? To be an ally in ways in which you're putting yourself on the line in either small or large ways. So as we're doing those things, those relational types of things, right? Understand our position more and to care for the relations. What these teachings of mind are inviting us into is, how do we study or listen to our own heart and mind? How are we present with? How do we study the self, right? That has all kinds of forces moving through it in relationship to racialized experiences. How do we study that? And as we study it, is there a possibility for transforming the things that are not helpful? Right? To transforming the things that keep us bound in the karma of harming self and other through race and power positions. How do we transform those into things that will be helpful? How do we transform those into ways that help lift everyone up? This is not, it's easy to say, but it's not easy to do. So we can study this through Zazen. We can study our mind very directly in meditation, and we may encounter some things there, but the capacity that we develop through sitting meditation needs to be expanded so that our feeling across various positions and relations is also brought in, right? So it's not just I'm going to sit and I'm going to encounter everything in the midst of Zazen. You will encounter some things, but the capacity you develop there to stay present, particularly if you're sitting Zazen in such a way that you're not disinviting your difficult emotional states, right? But you're cultivating a breadth that can be present with them. Then when you're in this kind of work, right? When you're caring for relations in all of these different ways, discovering your own blindnesses, discovering your own tendencies, discovering your own power position, the difficult emotions that come with that, you have a chance to do something with them because you're developing that capacity to be able to be present. You get to know your position of experience. If in the relational way, you've got to get to know your position of power, here you've got to get to know your position of experience. How are you actually experiencing it, right? It's one thing to be able to cop to your position of power within the social structure, but to be able to get to know your own internal karmic conditioning and how that shows up in your heart and mind is really important. then these two become a mutually supportive inquiry. Okay? We discover about our internal conditions as we explore how our outward behavior is limited by our inward conditions. Right? As we're trying to do this outward relational work, if we stay present with our internal states, I'm using outward and inward here in a way that's kind of provisional but important. So your inward states of experience, how are they as you're in this outward relational work? And as you can understand those inward states, and you can, I don't mean understand them with your head, but I mean feel them deeply, then your capacity to see how limited your relational capacity is, because your internal state is conflicted, it's shut down, it's living in fear, or it's grabbing onto something in some way. Right? You can feel that. You can feel the relationship between the two. And the other is also true. The field of your relational work, as it's narrow, the depth of your own heart's experience will also be narrow. Right? So they condition each other. And they can work together to show the kind of limitation that we've developed inside of ourselves that's also showing up outside of ourselves. And then there's a challenge. The challenge to inwardly face self-delusion, self-view, self-conceit, self-attachment. Right? To inwardly face it with wisdom and compassion, and to outwardly face it with work for justice. Right? So outward work, if you think about that self-delusion, self-view, self-conceit, self-attachment, these are the kind of things that try to twist our social situations to get all the balls rolling my direction, right? And particularly around racial conditioning, we've set a whole system up which has been, one of the most profound systems of inequity that humans have ever created, and it is created through race, and it's so that the advantage will roll towards white people, and that people of color will be disenfranchised from those same kind of opportunities. So what I'm saying here is that inward work and the outward work both deal with the way in which we have this self-delusion that we are separate from other beings, that we can be the subject of the story, and everything else is simply the supporting cast or the object. So as we've got to face it outwardly, but we also have to face it inwardly. Now, going along with this, I'm going to go a little bit into the mental factors, which are one of the things that we would work with directly as we're working with our inward state. I want to say before that the outward challenging, I'm going to leave behind here for a second, but I don't want us to forget about it. It's core. Right? Another aspect of the outward challenging is ethics, and why Buddhism has not traditionally, although it's shifting in the West quite a bit, not taken up a big banner of justice in most of the places that Buddhism has gone. It has been very, very, very involved in ethics, right? In what is an ethical life. And so if you think about an outward expression, we could talk about justice, but we could also talk about that in terms of ethic. What is my behavior, but also what is social behavior? What is the behavior of society? And that takes place there. We're going to turn our mind now towards the teachings of mind, which are more of that inner work. Am I going too fast? Okay. Too bad if I am, because that's how fast it is. When we turn to these, some of the specificities of the mind teaching beyond the model, which I wrote up here before, we typically within Yogacara teaching, when we're talking about working with the mind, we talk about different factors that exist within the mind. There are a few of them which are neutral, and there's a few which are universal. And what that means is we're not going to pay much attention to them right now. If you were studying Yogacara and really as a practice, you would pay attention to what's the quality of them being universal or neutral. But what I want to pay attention to tonight, because of our limited time, are the majority of them, which are either referred to as hindrances or afflictions, or they're referred to as beneficial factors. Okay? When we talk about doing this transformative work, at the core of it, from these mind teachings, is for us to become very, very familiar with. Okay, I want to emphasize this: very, very familiar with, very, very related to, very, very sensitive to our afflictions, our hindrances. And this is something that is not always easy for us to do, because we want to turn towards solutions. We want to turn towards what's the right thing to do, what's going to make us feel better, what's going to make everything better. And this teaching is telling us we can't go there right off the bat, because the part of our mind that wants to grasp onto the solution oftentimes is also controlled very strongly by the dominating part of our spirit that just wants to eject all the stuff that is inconvenient. And this is core to our racialized power structure as well. So the first thing we can talk about is, how do we identify, how do we get to know the afflictions? And I'll just read the list of the classical list of the afflictions, just so you can get a sense of what they sound like. Desire, aversion, delusion, pride, wrong view, doubt. Those are the primary afflictions. Secondary afflictions are anger, hatred, hypocrisy, malice, envy, selfishness, deceitfulness, guile, arrogance, harmfulness, lack of conscience or humility, sluggishness, restlessness, lack of faith, laziness, carelessness, forgetfulness, distraction, unawareness. Yeah. So there are a lot of yogis who spend a lot of time trying to classify what are all these states, okay, and what are they like, right? And I think for many of us today, unless we really get into the Yogacara teachings, the lists were just a little like, oh God, what am I supposed to do with that? And I would say if you're inclined to study Yogacara teachings, those lists have a lot to teach you about a refinement of your sensitivity about what is a hindrance or what is an affliction. When we hear the list, though, sometimes we'll hear things that sound like, well, is that always bad? Well, no, like doubt, for example. Doubt can be very helpful to us. So this is not this is not a list that's trying to say anytime you have any of those feelings, it is necessarily bad. It is saying there is a quality that all these words are calling out that relates to a type of hindrance. Like, what is the type of doubt that just keeps you from doing anything? It just keeps you debilitated because you can't put your foot forward and trust enough to even take, like one kind of step in a direction, right? That's the kind of doubt that is usually referred to as the affliction. Now, within the Zen school, for example, we have big praise for great doubt, the kind of doubt that asks you to really investigate the roots of your own being and the roots of the world and the roots of truth, right? So that kind of doubt is not considered negative affliction. But the kind of doubt that is immobilizing in terms of being able to investigate or function is seen as negative. So when we look at those different things, they're kind of like not a switchboard isn't the right word. They're kind of like a matrix that's trying to help us figure out what is the quality of our own affliction. If you look at the primary afflictions, desire, aversion, delusion, pride, wrong view, and doubt, those almost just completely map on to the four afflictions that I talked about in relationship with manas. So if you talk about self-delusion, that's delusion, right? If you talk about self-attachment, that's greed and hate, right? Or desire and aversion. You see how desire and aversion are both a form of attachment. One is you're trying to get the things away from you, and one you're trying to get the things closer to you. Pride is self-conceit. Wrong view is self-view. Right? It's viewing through the lens of self, but thinking that's just how the world is, as opposed to it being the way that I'm seeing it because of the karma that I come into the situation with. And then you add doubt to that, and you get your primary afflictions. What I'd like to focus on tonight is the most famous of the afflictions, which are known as the three poisons. And we usually translate it as greed, hate, and delusion. Okay? Sometimes we use the word ignorance. Sometimes we might use the word grasping, Sometimes we might use aversion. There's different language, and within the Sanskrit and Chinese and stuff too, there are slightly different words that get used. But I think this is the language that we're usually working with. And so there's subtleties to all of these, but these are really considered to be the central ones, and they show up right at the top of the list of hindrances. So it's kind of a radical thing to say you've actually got to feel. You've got to feel your aversion. You have to feel your attraction to having power. You have to feel the delusion, the separateness, the unwillingness to be intimate with others. And we need to know that. So that's the invitation of the hindrances or the afflictions. The very, very famous quote from Dogen Zenji gets quoted all the time, where he says, "To study the way is to study the self." Right? And oftentimes people like to skip over that and go to say, to study the self is to forget the self. We like the forgetting part, but this is this part. To study the way is to study the self. Now, if these are the afflictions, we also have beneficial factors. So it says within the manas and the alaya, the factors that are moving out through there are beneficial mind states. All right, and so the mind is not only in the kind of affliction, but it also has things that are moving towards liberation. We can talk about this as positive karma often. So the list again from the kind of traditional list is faith, conscience, humility, lack of desire, lack of aversion, lack of delusion, energy, tranquility, carefulness, equanimity, and nonviolence. So these are also in us, or these are also who we are. We have these kinds of capacities, right? And I want to focus on three of them, the ones that correspond to the three poisons. So in the traditional way of talking about it, it says that the beneficial factor is lack of desire, lack of aversion, lack of delusion. We could also talk about it positively, and it oftentimes is, as generosity. Loving kindness or compassion, and delusion is wisdom. Okay? So if these three poisons, if these are part of the afflictions, sorry, that's not very legible, and these are beneficial. So these teachings are telling us that we need to feel both of these. Now this is the part that I find, this makes sense, right? Okay, beneficial stuff, harmful stuff. This is the part to me that's really revolutionary about these teachings. Is it if we just war between these two, if we say, okay, I need to get rid of all of my afflictions, let me try to kick them out, and let me try to be these things, that would be pretty good. We could go a certain distance, and we can make a lot of progress. But what these teachings tell us is that these do not come from a separate mind. There's not a part of our mind that we can kick out and just keep the other part of our mind. But that what makes the afflictions is the fact that we always want to treat them in a certain way. They are bounded. And all the things that make the beneficial things is because they don't partake in that process of further binding. They take part in the process of liberating. So what we want to do with the beneficial mind factors is we want to treat the afflictions with them. All right? We don't want to replace greed with generosity. We want to face greed with non-judgment. I know that. I'll just say what it is, and then you'll know what it is. We want to meet hate with compassion, and we want to meet delusion with intimacy. Okay. Yeah.
Can we ask questions or no?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, what just came to mind is we make offerings to the hungry ghost, which always early just blew my mind.
Yeah.
And we're making little offerings.
Yeah.
Rather than just saying, you're evil, go away.
Exactly. So how do we face greed? How do we face the hungry ghost? We give them an offering. Right? How do we face aversion and hate? We face it with compassion. And how do we face delusion? Not by trying to expel delusion, by getting to know it, being intimate with it, right? Being right there with our own partiality, our own sense that I'm right? And giving it the space of attention. So when we meet the afflictions with these beneficial mind states, not to make a war, but so there is a really sincere meeting within ourself. This is where transformation can happen. It's not wrestling one thing into the other, right? And when it comes to a practice to hold broadly and stably and intimately the karma of race, we need this kind of heart, because it doesn't just turn over. I mean, it doesn't just turn over out there, but it also doesn't just turn over in here. It's not like one day we just wake up and then it's, oh, I'm done. I got over race. No, the tendrils of the karma that's there are deeply laid within our being. And so our work, from a Yogacara perspective, is, yes, do the work to overcome that conditioning, so we can also overcome the societal conditioning that keeps people bound in this oppressive system. But to do that, we've got to be weeding out all of those places in which it lives within me. And that again doesn't happen by force, but it does take challenging. You've got to challenge your inward self, the conditioning that's there. You can't just say it's inevitable. It's replicating again and again and again and again. But the challenge is not a challenge to let me, show up and I'm going to kill you. It's the challenge to actually face it, to be intimate with it, to be non-judgmental with it, to be compassionate with it, so that a transformation can take place. That kind of I'm talking here about these mind teachings. This is something that's happening within ourselves as we're doing the work, the outward work. It's helping us to develop a kind of self-knowing that allows our daily action to unfold in a different way. And fundamentally, from our Buddhist teachings, the mind is central to how it is that we're going to live on a day-to-day life. So it needs reformed. And so one of the questions that I think arises, is very important to arise, is where do we get the capacity? It's easy for me to say, you need to face the greed, hate, and delusion with generosity, compassion, and wisdom. Be intimate with it. Be compassionate with it. Be non-judgmental with it. Can I do that? Can I actually turn towards my horrible parts and not just fall into self-loathing? What is that? To me, this is why religion is really important. I mean, people have different relationship with the idea of religion, but I mean here spiritual teaching, however it is that it's palatable to you. I think there's something it has to offer. One way we can talk about the capacity comes through practice, right? We have certain practices that we can take up, and I'm saying that first because that's kind of the obvious answer, and it works. But why does practice work? Practice doesn't work just because it's a certain technique to leverage your life. Practice works because it's about something that we've received. Right? It's about, we have received the heart of beings that live with that capacity to hold the karma. And I don't only mean those beings that we typically are venerating at the temple. I also mean those. Of course the Buddha, of course the Bodhisattvas, they meet us and we receive something from them. That's why we call it the Buddha way, right? It's not the human way, it's the Buddha way, to live as an awakened being. And we have that example, and we receive something quite mysteriously from the world of awakening and from the world of spirits. But we also receive it from our heroes. Think of the people who are examples to you of people who are facing racial injustice with great integrity and conviction. How do they hold it day to day? You can't know exactly, but you could try to hold it. You could say, oh, there's someone has the capacity. I know there is such thing as capacity. How do I engender the capacity in myself? That's what I'm doing when I'm practicing. Your friends, your family, your community, the people who you see that you know are doing that. They are a great ally to you in practice, in the sense that they transmit to you the faith that you can face these things, not as your enemies, but you can face them as a way to generate this great capacity. And so I just say that because it's, practice can seem so much like, okay, here's the lever, pull the thing, be compassionate. Okay, put the compassion coin in. That will never work. It actually has to be inspired. And that inspiration comes from you, but the inspiration also comes through you and comes to you because you're connected to this world of inspiring beings. And that world's out there, and the world's also, in here. And this is why people will often recommend in racial justice work. They'll say you need to read African American authors, for example. One of the really clear reasons for that is to be able to see another perspective. Right? That's important. But there's something else there that an African American author is showing you their heart. They're showing you what it means to hold the karma of race. And that's something which is fundamentally important. And any author who takes up the work of facing race, not necessarily writing directly about race, we can receive from there. Okay. I mean to get too preachy. I am a preacher, by the way, though. It's my other job. So the last thing, which I don't want to talk too much about, I want to talk just enough about, but it is is really the thing that many Zen people are attracted to. People are attracted to Zen are usually attracted to this aspect of the Yogacara teachings, and that is upending or overturning at the root. Right? So we look at this, we say, this what seems like an endless activity, which is the endless activity of facing greed, hate, and delusion with generosity, compassion, and wisdom. Is there not some way in which we could just overcome this delusion in a very, very fundamental way? In a way, this type of work where we're working with the beneficial mind states and the afflictions, we can talk about as working primarily with generosity and compassion. Right? And then what is it to work with wisdom? What is it to get right down to the very root? What is the Prajnaparamita teachings, for example, that tell us that there's just no place to stand? Now, I believe that these mind teachings are really great medicine for people who are attracted to the overturning at the root. These kinds of transformative mind teachings about afflictive states and beneficial states. We really need to hear this if you're a person who is attracted to the teaching of emptiness, for example. Because they invite us into the actuality of the practice as opposed to the fantasy of emptiness, right? When we think about teachings like emptiness is not a negation that can be wielded. If you're wielding the negation that comes from emptiness, you've missed it, right? So you hear this within things around race, for example, is like, what was this famous thing that people used to say? Love sees no color, right? Bullshit. That is a place where you say love, right? We translate that for emptiness into Buddhism, although they're not exactly the same. But I say, it's empty. There is no essentially race. There's no essential race. Race is not something that is a thing that's just there. It comes through all of these conditions and through all these relations, so it's not real. So why don't we just stop talking about race and just get over it? You hear people say this all the time, right? The problem with the teachings about overturning at the root is they can so quickly be dominated by the mind, by a dominating mind that co-opts them and uses them for the purposes of just cutting out any trouble. Who wants to be bothered with all of this? Meeting negative karma? Ugh. I would much rather, just go along my own way. And so it's very easy for any kind of these teachings on upturning at the root to get used in that way. And furthermore, it is a deep form of problematic karma when we are denying the outward states of multiplicity. Okay? Whenever you find yourself doing this, saying, "Oh, no, it's all the same. This is all just a social construct anyway," right? When you're denying that outward states of multiplicity, the positionality of beings, right? There's all these beings which are in different positions. When you're ever denying that, it's definitely an attempt to deny the multiplicity of your own heart or mind, right? When you're saying, like, I don't want to pay attention to there's all these different kinds of beings with different feelings and different positions within the society and different power relations. When you don't want to pay attention to this, it's also because you don't want to pay attention to that multiplicity that's in your own heart. Your own difficulty of facing the difficult parts of your own being, right? We get tired of that and we'd rather it just goes away. So we really have to pay attention here, that any of these kind of teachings don't get used in this way, that they get used to help bring us closer to what it means to face the poisons with the medicine, right? The medicine doesn't fight with the poisons, right? The medicine is there to meet the poisons. Right? That's what the medicines do. So that's a big wind-up to reading you the very short. So in Vasubandhu's 30 verses, of the 30 verses, there's just a few that are really dedicated to overturning at the root, and they go like this. As long as consciousness does not rest in projection only. Let me say something about that. Projection only is one of the teachings of Yogacara. In fact, it's the way that we oftentimes know it. We call it consciousness only school, right? It's saying that any phenomena that you meet, any phenomena is a projection, right? It's a projection of the karma of your being. So, when I meet you, you are projection. You're projection of this karma. I am completely involved in your appearing as a phenomena to me. Right? So in this kind of teaching, it says we should regard all phenomena as projections. Right? That's what's referred to as projection only. So it says, as long as consciousness does not rest in projection only, the tendencies of grasping self and other will not cease. So as long as we think that things are just how they are, they're not my projection, then I'll keep on grasping after self. But by conceiving what you put before you to be projection only, you do not rest in projection only. This is really key part. So he's saying that if you look at something, I'll stop picking on Rose. If you look at the cup, and you say, oh, this is only projection. He's saying that's not what resting in projection only means. Right? That is you projecting the idea of a projection onto a thing, which now you're going to treat as an object to your subject. You now become, you haven't released subject and object. You have just now created the perfect situation in which you can inflict your subject upon this object without remorse. Because it's only a projection. Right? So he's saying that's not it. You can't just call things projections, although they are projections. If you're going to rest in the projection only, that's the next stanza. When consciousness does not perceive any object, then it rests in projection only. When there is nothing to grasp, there is no grasping. Without thought, without conception, this is the supramundane awareness, the overturning of the root, the ending of the two barriers. So in a kind of simple language, he's encouraging us to give up the perceiving of objects, to stop regarding phenomena as objects, to stop regarding phenomena as objects and start meeting them intimately. They are not objects of our cognition. We are intimate with them. We don't try to perceive them and classify them and push them around and do things with them. We let them be. Thus, that is the medicine of generosity, compassion, and wisdom. A complete offering. And then the last line, and this is, I think, one of the things that really inspires me to the relationship between this teaching and racial justice, is it says, it is the inconceivable, wholesome, unstained, constant realm, the blissful body of liberation, the Dharma body of the great sage. The blissful body of liberation, the Dharma body of the great sage. If we try to go there just by denying the varieties of bodies, then we end up just forcibly handling ourselves and others and compounding the problem. But when we can encounter things without having to make them something else, offering our awareness, offering our compassion, then they have a chance to show up as something different than what it is that we have pegged them to be. And that is the blissful body of awakening. It's the blissful body of the Buddha. But we don't get there through elimination. We get there through a full meeting of the karma. So in a sense, this overturning at the root is just simply another way of talking about what it means to meet the negative karma of our own being. And this, I would say, is what I find to be the really, for myself, why I can and do turn back to these teachings when I'm trying to do this work around racial justice, but really around all of the ways in which humans have learned to devalue each other and devalue all types of phenomena for the purposes of our very narrow view of what is a beautiful and blissful body. So that's my presentation for tonight. I know I said this at the beginning, but if you're interested in these teachings and using them, really, using them, I'm just kind of giving you a little taste of what's possible. I really recommend this book by Ben Conley, very seasoned practitioner, Minnesota, I think is right. And this is maybe just a few years old. We use this for a study session maybe 3 years ago or so when it first came out. But I think this is the most accessible book. It's not. He's very scholarly, learned in this tradition, but he doesn't present this book as a kind of like a very scholarly like dissection of Yogacara, but more an invitation into the kind of work that I've been talking about here. And he is also a person who's very active in anti-racism work and other kind of social justice things. So I do highly recommend that. A good place to start if you're interested in incorporating these teachings more fully. Okay.